Hello, this is Dr. Aaron Willis with Social Studies School Service and Nystrom Education. I wanted to welcome you today to our webinar on using narratives your students will love. We have a guest presenter today, Steve Sheinkin, a notable young adult author who's written a number of books, and he'll be sharing some of those titles with you today. And he'll be telling you a little bit about how he came to be writing books that were not textbooks. That's where he started, and how his adventures have taken him elsewhere. We absolutely love his content, and we love being able to have these readings in active classroom. It's a wonderful benefit to you and your students, and I hope that this will give you some incentive to explore his work on a deeper level. Before I turn the stage over to Steve, I would like to make sure that you're all aware that you can find this content in active classroom. I'm on our Find Activities page here, and I can go here to series title, and we've got this under Storyteller's History. So if you just go down to Storyteller's Histories here and hit search, it'll bring up, what we've done is we have 3 different books that have been broken up into their individual chapters. One of them being King George, What Was His Problem? About the origins of the American Republic and the early Revolution. We have also Two Miserable Presidents, about the Civil War, and Which Way to the Wild West, focusing on the Wild West. So we're able to cover everything from about the 1750s up through the 1850s in a highly engaging style that's written and is very accessible not only for students and adults. With that said, I'm going to turn this over to Steve to take it away, and let me find him on my list to make him the presenter. And Steve, you should have the controls now, and go ahead and launch your PowerPoint, and I'm going to mute myself and let you take it away.
Okay, are you seeing a screen with those 3 books on the cover?
You do see the books.
That what I'm talking actually matches what I'm talking about? All right, that's good. So thank you, Aaron. That's a nice introduction, and these are stories I love telling. I never set out to be a nonfiction writer, which is kind of funny. My brother and I, when we were kids, all we wanted to do was be movie makers. And in a weird way, it led to this job, though in a very circuitous sort of way. We tried making movies for a while. It didn't work out exactly as planned. We made a movie, but it didn't ever actually make any money. It was a great experience, but the short version is that I just needed a job, and I still wanted to be a writer, and I got this job writing textbooks, these kind of textbooks, and it's kind of a joke on me at the time, I thought, because I, of course, didn't like these books when I was in school, and so I thought it was kind of funny to find a job writing them, but it was good practice for me, and really what made this a career, and I didn't expect it to, was that I kept finding stories that they wouldn't let me put in. My job eventually was to write chapters of textbooks, and you never see the name of the actual writer in these books. So it's kind of anonymous, but I would get assignments, for instance, write a chapter about the American Revolution. And that was kind of a big break for me to get to do my own writing, and it was exciting because I always felt like, wow, history can actually be fun to read. It doesn't have to be boring, though a lot of kids, as many of you know, of course, consider it boring, but it's really the way that it can be written about that's boring as opposed to the actual material. So all right, I'll just give one example. I like to start with examples. So this is the famous Paul Revere's ride, and here he is doing his famous British are coming bit. But when the publishers or the editors at this textbook company asked me to write about the Revolution, they said, we want it to be exciting. We want it to have grabbers. And so I took that seriously, and I did a lot of research and found this great story from the night. This is April 18th now of 1775. And every book has the Paul Revere ride in it, but I found this bit that came right before it that I thought was really great. It was from Revere's own notes, and he said that he was going to leave Boston to do this job. He had this very specific job to leave the city and report that the British were coming out to Lexington and Concord to take the guns away from the militia. But of course the British knew him, and they knew he was essentially a spy, and they weren't going to let him leave. So they were looking for him that night. And that's the great setting of this scene. It's that night in Boston, it's dark, and he goes down to the river to cross the river so that he can get on the horse and do what became the famous bit. But there's a British warship right in the river, and they're looking for him. And there's no way he can get across in a rowboat because rowboats are so loud and squeaky. So the two guys, these young sons of liberty who were going to row him across, said, you know what we need? We need some cloth. If we had some cloth to wrap around the oarlocks, we could silence them or muffle them at least, and we'd have a chance of getting across the river right under the bow of this British ship. So they ran to, one of them had a girlfriend essentially who lived right nearby, and they called up to her window. And I love this scene of they're kind of running through these dark cobblestone streets, and the British are marching down to the water. And they call up to her window to throw down some cloth. And she, without missing a beat, took off the petticoat she was wearing and threw it out the window. And Revere caught it and never forgot that detail. Who would? I mean, it was just one of those little things that you would never forget. And they ran down to the river and they used it. He said they ripped it up and wrapped it around the oars, and they rowed across silently. They made it. And then he got on the horse and did the Paul Revere ride that we all know about. But I thought, what a great opening to a scene. And I could write that in a couple hundred words. It could be half a page. And so this is just kind of one example that encapsulates 10 years of my life as a textbook writer. I went into the meeting and told them that story basically the same way I just did. And the textbook editors who were really experienced, and they really do want these books to be good, believe it or not. They don't want them to be boring. And they said, oh yeah, that's really good. That's the kind of stuff we should be doing. And then they started second guessing themselves and saying, yeah, but maybe that story could get us in trouble. And they started thinking of ways it would get them in trouble. Specifically that it was a woman and that the petticoat was sort of like underwear. And can you have that in a textbook? And can you have her taking off clothes and throwing them out the window? And all these things that, of course, fifth graders would love. I have a fifth grade daughter now, so I know this age really well. And they're never worried about offending the kids. They're worried about some parent, you know the drill on that. Someone somewhere is going to complain and people will get, quote, in trouble. And the textbook makers are very worried about that. So that was my life for many years, and I could do hours and hours of rejected stories, which I'll spare you. We could do that some other time. But at the same time I was doing this, I was working or really volunteering at a tutoring center after school and working with these 10, 11-year-old kids. And they would bring in their textbooks, and I would see them reading or attempting to read their textbooks. And these two experiences together, all the rejected stories plus the experience of sitting with these kids, and they just could not get through a page of these books without losing focus, really inspired me to try to do something different. And this is where this all led. This book called King George, What Was His Problem?, which was my first book. And the title obviously gives you an idea that it's meant to be a little funny and irreverent. And I took all the stories, like the Paul Revere and the petticoat story, that they wouldn't let me put into textbooks, and made a whole book out of it because there are that many of them just from the Revolution alone. And as you can see on the cover, there are comics in it as well. And throughout the book there are interspersed, every spread has a comic or two. And I thought that would really also make it much more accessible. And so I actually drew I love telling kids this when I go to schools. I drew all the pictures myself, and then when it finally got picked up and published by Roaring Brook, the publisher there said, yeah, now we're going to hire a good artist to do all the art. So when you look at it, you'll see my name as the writer, but this guy, Tim Robinson, is the artist. And that combination worked out really well. And we did a few books together. But in this first one, I was finally able to get in all that stuff. I'll just tell you some examples. This is in the middle of this picture is the notorious Benedict Arnold. He's the guy on the horse with his knee raised in the middle. And all I knew about him, like every kid, was that he was a traitor in the Revolution. But what was missing, and what I found out when I researched textbooks, was that it's really one of the all-time great action-adventure stories of American history. He's sort of like a loose cannon action hero you'd see in a movie, but 200 years before movies existed. And so what a waste to not tell his story. In textbooks, there's just no room for it. And also, they're kind of worried about the kind of moral ambiguity of, well, they don't trust kids to be able to handle it. Like, for instance, Arnold was a bad guy, and that's all you need to know. But the truth is he was a hero and a villain. And textbooks like to oversimplify things. Uh, they don't trust kids enough to tell them that he was a hero and a villain. And frankly, that so many of our founders did terrible things as well as great things. And so they try to simplify that. And one of the things that gets lost is stories like Benedict Arnold, who was a great American hero. This is him at the Battle of Saratoga, where he would just charge in ahead of his men and led the Americans to the biggest victory of the entire war. Some people, they didn't understand how he could be so recklessly brave. They thought either he's crazy, is he getting drunk before battle? Everywhere he went, he made friends and enemies all at the same time, and everything he did was over the top and dramatic. So his story is just an example of one of the ones I was finally able to tell in that book. Or some of the quotes. This kind of speaks to the moral ambiguity question. This is one of the quotes from one of the founders of our country. Would anyone believe that I am the master of slaves of my own purchase? I will not, I cannot justify it. And I was really interested to learn, which I never did in school, that the founders wrestled with these questions as they were writing these great documents. And that you can guess on your own. There's not going to be a test, but that was Patrick Henry who said that. Same guy who said, give me liberty or give me death, which I think is just really loaded and interesting that the same person would say those two things. And it tells you a lot about the contradictions in the heart of our history. And I think that's a big part of it. It's the fun stories, but it's also those challenging stories. Those two things together, those are what make history fun and compelling and worth learning about. So this became a series. I never expected it to, but we started with King George. These are the covers that they have right now. They changed and updated them, but the content has stayed the same. And then I went on to do one on the Civil War, two miserable presidents, and one on westward expansion. Again, using all the stuff that the textbooks wouldn't let me put in. And I'll just give you a few more examples before we could maybe hopefully do some questions. But okay, Sarah Edmonds, these are two of the women who disguised themselves as men during the Civil War to fight, and I think these stories are just fascinating. Some of the best ones to tell when I go to schools, because I just know they're going to work. They're going to be interesting and compelling. That this 18-year-old girl, Sarah Edmonds, would have run away from home because she didn't want to get married. Her father wanted her to get married, and disguised herself as a man. And all the details of how you do that, how you get away with it. How could you enlist in the Army when women aren't allowed to serve in the Army? How did you stay in disguise when you're surrounded by thousands of men every day, every minute of every day? I love telling all those details. And Loretta Velasquez did the same thing, but from the South. She fought for the Confederacy, where Sarah Edmonds was fighting for the Union. And I liked her before and after picture, which kind of shows the mustache goatee getup that she wore. And a great little detail that, again, would never fit in a textbook, but that's the kind of thing that makes history fun, is that Loretta was at dinner one night and she took a big drink of milk and her mustache started to fall off. And I just think that would make a great scene in a TV series, which I think we should make about these guys, these women who dressed as men. I think that would make a great series. And details like that are the hooks I absolutely need to get kids interested in history. And then you follow these people into important battles and the dates and all the things that we want to know. But once you know the people and start rooting for them, then it becomes easy to remember, and hopefully you want to know. You actively actually want to know more. And this guy's another good example of that. Robert Smalls, who was born into slavery in South Carolina, and he worked on this boat, the Planter. And he was a great pilot. He was a very, very skilled and trained pilot coming in and out of Charleston, which is very difficult navigation. But he was enslaved, and he and a bunch of other enslaved young black men were forced to work on this Navy ship during the Civil War. They realized audaciously that maybe they could escape. It was really essentially a prison, but what if they tried to escape using the ship? And this is one of the all-time great escape stories. They practiced for months their plan that they were going to pretend to be the crew. They were going to leave in the middle of the night, pretend to be the crew of this ship on a normal mission. And they sailed out of the harbor in the middle of the night, knowing, of course, if they got seen, that it would be obvious that they were not the proper crew, which, of course, the officers were all white. on this Confederate naval ship. But they knew all the signals to blow as they passed forts in the harbor. They blew these signals on the whistle of the ship, and they made it. They made it out. And it's amazing. They of course, became super famous, and Robert Smalls went to the White House and met Abraham Lincoln and later became a congressman from South Carolina. And so it's a great story. There's a lot of history in it, but it also is a great personal story. And sometimes you just have to throw in really funny stories too, silly stories. Like this is, okay, here's Lewis and Clark. And for instance, you would never see this in a textbook, but one day in their expedition, here they are in the expedition, you see Sacagawea, who really is kind of the hero, I think, of this story. And I was able to get her story in the Wild West book. But also this silly one where they're hunting one day. Of course, they had to hunt. And one of the guys aimed at a deer or an elk or something and missed and accidentally shot Lewis, or rather shot Clark in the butt by accident. And Clark turned around, and what makes it even more funny, I think, is that the guy tried to deny it. Clark felt this terrible pain in his butt and turned around and said, "Hey, what was that?" And some guy behind him has this gun, with smoke coming out of it, saying, "Well, I don't know. I have no idea. That wasn't me." And so Clark had to ride face down in the canoe for a couple of weeks because he couldn't sit for a while. And that's just, is that important? No. Would it ever be on a test? Of course not. But it's the kind of thing that makes history funny and fun. And if you tell kids that story, then they'll want to know other stories from the expedition. And next thing you know, they actually have learned what it is we're trying to teach them about what Lewis and Clark were doing. And just one final one, similar kind of thing. This is a not famous, but should be famous part of the gold rush story. Again, one of those stories we all want kids to know about gold being found in California and how that really totally changed world history. But there's this little known part of it, this woman named Jenny Wimmer, where these guys found gold. The funny thing of it is that none of them actually knew if it was gold. It was just this yellow, crumpled metal that looked kind of like a piece of chewed up chewing gum. And they weren't sure because none of them had ever seen gold before. But there was one person in the whole camp out there who had seen gold. And it was a woman. It was this woman named Jenny Wimmer who had panned for gold in Georgia, where she was from. And she happened to be making soap. She was making lye to make soap, this really caustic liquid. And she said, "I'll put this metal that we think might be gold." She knew it was just from seeing it. "So I'll prove it to you. I'll put it in this. And if it's real gold, it won't be tarnished by the lye. But if it is, if fool's gold, pyrite, it will rust." And she did it, and she dropped it in and pulled it out a couple hours later, and it was, of course, as bright and shiny as ever. And that proved to everyone that it really was gold. And that really, as much as anything, set off the gold rush. And again, just a little kind of side story that should be famous, but that isn't, that kind of gets you going, gets you into the bigger, quote, more important part of the story. And that's what I've tried to do ever since. I'm not going to tell you the story behind all these books, but that's what I've been doing these last few years. I finally got to write a whole book about Benedict Arnold, which was always a dream of mine. I got to write this crazy story, Lincoln's Grave Robbers, about guys who tried to steal. These are criminals in Chicago in the 1870s who tried to steal Abraham Lincoln's body from the tomb. Again, a great story to tell if you think kids are going to be reluctant about history. And then some more serious ones, Port Chicago 50, a civil rights story from World War II, Bomb, a great spy and science story from World War II also. Most Dangerous is set during the Vietnam War. And then my most recent one is Undefeated, a great underdog sports story about Jim Thorpe and the Carlisle Indian School, where he went essentially to college. And it's set in the world of college football in the early 1900s. And that this tiny, tiny school at a Native American boarding school called Carlisle took on the world, took on the biggest, most powerful, richest universities with the goal of becoming one of the great football teams in the country. And they did it against all odds. It should have been impossible, but this is the true story of how they did it. And again, it's one of those stories that I think it should be more famous, and it's also really fun. It's not a happy story all the time by any means, but it's one of those things that would have gotten me into history when I was 12 years old. And that's really all I can do, is think back to how I was 10, 11, 12, 13 and try to write the kinds of stories that would have hooked me. And that's really basically what I do every day now. So I think that's a good introduction to my life these days as a researcher and writer. I'm always looking for that next story, of course, and I'm always talking to kids. I go to a lot of schools and love to hear feedback because you know how honest they are about what works, what they're interested in, what they're not, and
Well,
it's turned
Steve,
into a really fun job. Yeah,
so
please go ahead.
thank you very much. My first question was going to be, and I'm just going to segue into it, and then I'll open it up to questions from others. But what kind of questions do you get from the students? What do they come up with, and what have you learned from how they're engaged?
Yeah, they hook onto really. This is one of the things I've learned, and I only could have learned from directly from working with kids, is that they'll hook on to these kinds of stories that I just told you, like the Robert Small story. I'll just tell that tiny little story. There was a really good escape, but I don't have time to tell you the whole thing. Then they'll come back a half an hour later when I open it up to questions. They'll say, "What about that? How did they do it? What do you mean the ship was full of ammunition? Like, what if it blew up? And what kind of secret signals did they use? And how did they pick up and make sure their family was able to escape?" And so those kind of questions are so useful to me because it reminds me of what it is that makes this stuff interesting. And so I love getting that. And they also will ask, uh, you know, about why do you want to do this? Why do you want to write about history? I don't think history is interesting. And so I feel sometimes I have to try to win them over with these kinds of stories too. But it's good. It keeps me on my toes.
What about from adults? Do adults read these books as well, and what kind of response do you get there?
Yes, they do, especially the more recent ones, which are aimed a little older. I mean, I think of them as middle school books, but of course anyone can read them, and younger and older kids do, and they more relate to it, especially stories that have taken place in the 20th century. They'll know somebody who's involved, or they'll have a parent or grandparent who was somehow a part of the story and want to tell me about a personal connection. That happens with kids too. I've been amazed at how many kids claim to have a connection to Benedict Arnold, especially. Somehow that's become cool. Now they think, I'm somehow related to Benedict Arnold, and they want to tell me about personal things. And that's how I know it's working, when they get excited and they want to tell me something. They said, "Did you ever think of writing about this?" That's really the number one reaction I get, is they want to tell me their ideas for what I should do.
Oh, have you taken them up on any of those?
Yeah, I got a lot of feedback about sports stories, and I always wanted to do one, so that really led to Undefeated. That was one of my top uh, pieces of advice that I got, and so yeah, I do listen to that, and I also just keep a running list of suggestions.
Do you notice any difference, going back to the students again, and then I'm willing to open it up here. Do you notice a difference between the questions that boys ask versus girls? The way you said about sports made me think that might be gender specific, but I'm wondering if that's what you see or not.
Not not overall, no. I mean, there's that I guess you could call it a stereotype out there that the boys are a little more drawn toward nonfiction. And I guess overall, if you had to put a number on it, I would say that that's true in my experience. But I would never want to sit down and say, this is a book for boys, this is a book for girls,
Right,
because I
right.
meet so many kids who break all these stereotypes, my own daughter being one of them. And so I don't think that way. And the next book, the next nonfiction book I'm writing, all the main characters will be women, and I'm hoping that the boys will read it too. They better. That's I think sometimes we think they think about that more than they actually do.
Right. Well, Steve, thank you very much. I'm going to open it up to questions now. What I'm going to do is, everybody's been muted. I'm going to unmute all of you, which means that you can ask a question using your microphone. You can also post questions in the little chat area here, and then we'll make sure that Steve sees them, and we'll try and take on as many questions as possible. Do me a favor, though, if you're not asking a question or engaged in a dialogue, feel free to click on the little icon next to your name to mute yourself. Otherwise, we start to get background noise and odd things happening. So at this point, I'm going to unmute everybody and open it up to questions.
Oh, there you go.